Hello, I'm Jennifer Keller, Programming Coordinator at the Westport Library. Today, I'm happy to be speaking with Bette Bono, whose debut novel is called The Better Angels. Like many of us, she has taken an interesting route to writing. Bette worked as a political analyst in Washington, D.C., earned a law degree from Harvard, and then relocated to Connecticut. After working as an attorney, Bette decided to teach in public schools, serving in both classroom and as the union steward. And then she wrote and published a book that defies genre classifications and is now working on her second. So if you're participating in the Westport Library's Summer Reading Challenge, reading this book could fulfill a few categories. Just saying. Welcome, Bette.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here, and thank you for hosting this conversation.
We're so happy to have you. So let's just jump right in. Would you share the journey or the story of what led you to write The Better Angels?
All right. Here's my book, The Better Angels, and it's about a retired teacher. She's in her 60s, and we begin the story with her beginning to fear that perhaps she is suffering some of the symptoms of dementia or some other condition because she sees visions from the past. She sees a vintage airplane over JFK. She sees a phone booth at the gas station. Gas stations don't have phone booths anymore. And so she's quite worried about her condition, but then she is told that some rare seniors develop the ability to travel through time, and she is recruited into the American Association of Remarkable Persons, the other AARP, and sets off to solve a mystery in Civil War era New York City. So when I began writing, I was given the very good advice: know your genre and stick with your genre. And as I was developing the book, I realized, well, I've got elements of women's fiction. I have historical fiction. I have a mystery. I have a bit of romance. I have time travel, and I have a superhero origin story. So maybe I could step back and tell you how I got to that point. As you said in your kind introduction, I did teach for many years in middle school at Nathan Hale Middle School in Norwalk, right next door. And one day I was talking with my 8th grade students about some of their favorite books. So they were talking about Harry Potter, and they were talking about Twilight was still very big at that time. And then we got into comic books and some of their, comic book heroes and comic book movies. And the plot line for a lot of that type of literature is this: there's an ordinary teenager who discovers they have an extraordinary power, and they learn how to use it, and they fight for justice in some way. And the appeal of that story is that at a time when you're in a transition from being a teenager to being an adult, you take on a mission and you gain an understanding of yourself. And you probably know that that's really a coming of age story. And a superhero origin story is a type of coming of age story. It's like a subcategory of a coming of age story. So what happened was we started talking about, the students wanted to write a short story that would be somebody gets a superpower. And one of them said, Ms. Bono, if you were going to write, what kind of superpower would you choose? And we talked about, what's the best when you're in middle school, what's the best superpower is a big issue. Do you want to fly, or do you want to be invisible, or, whatever. So we talked about that. And I said, well, I would start with a different character first. I wouldn't begin with a teenager. I would begin with an older person, because I think that would be interesting if an older person got some sort of power. And they were not having it. No. And they said, you just told us that it's a coming of age story. And how can you have a coming of age story with somebody that's already old? So putting aside whether being in your 60s means you're old, put that aside for a minute. You know, so they gave me this question, and fortunately the bell rang, and then I went home, and I looked up. Here I am, you know, a teacher. I was a teacher for many years, but I looked up what is the coming of age story, and within that there's a quest for an adult identity. And what usually happens, the theme is, do you accept a socially constructed identity, or do you craft a more original or defiant or nonconformist identity? So the issue could be, can you have a quest for an adult identity when you're already an adult? And I thought about it, and I decided there is a definitive answer, and the definitive answer is maybe. Maybe you can, because in some ways, for some older people, for some seniors, some of the things you confront are similar to what younger people confront as they enter adulthood. You might ask yourself, what work am I doing now? What will be my mission now? What do I want to accomplish now? Where will I live? And is that place suitable for me, for someone my age? And I think most importantly, some older people ask themselves, what is my community? What community do I belong to? And for some seniors, it's decided. You have a bucket list, you have grandchildren, you are still working. Many people are working much longer into their lives. Or you are a volunteer, you have your own project, whatever, you're contented. But there are some who don't fall into that contented category. So I decided you could write a coming of age story for someone who was already old, as my 8th graders would put it, and that would be an interesting story to explore. And maybe it's coming of the next age, or coming of a little bit older age, or whatever you call it. That's how I got my character, my protagonist. And then I had to decide on her superpower, but that was easy for me because as an older person, it had to be time travel because I'm so interested in history. And I think a lot of older people are interested in history, and they have something to contribute. And you know, it's caricatured. Oh yeah, when I was a kid and we used to do this or used to do that, or I remember living through this or living through that. But I feel history is important. I wanted the theme of history to be there, and the effect of history on the present. So I had my protagonist. I gave her a superpower. I went back and told my students my great idea, and they were like, maybe. And then the summer came, and I thought, you know, I really want to write this. And I started, and then 2 years later, I had my rough draft. And we went from there.
Wow. So what was your process, or what is, I should say, since you're writing your second book, what is your process for writing? And as a teacher, as a former teacher, do you follow the format that teachers have been telling us for decades, which is you write an outline, you do the research, you write, and then you edit, and I could go on for days about editing. Or do you have a different way of writing?
I guess I have to confess to being one of those people that follows the outline, write, edit. And I love editing. I love it. But also I would add in, for the type of book that I wrote, the research part of it. And I did a lot of reading on the time period. One thing I wanted in the book, well, I wanted a lot of things in the book. I wanted it to be funny, and I wanted, you know, all these things to happen, but I wanted the history part to be accurate. I didn't want to veer into alternate history. I wanted the history part to be accurate. So a lot of research. The first book, strictly, I really believe in outlining, not in detail, but I knew where my story was going, and I wrote it sequentially. That's sort of kind of going out the window with the second one, because I'm writing all over the place, and I just now halfway through gotten it outlined. But the editing is the fun part. That's the joy. That's where you make it original and interesting and play with language, and I love that part of it.
So what words of wisdom, oh, wait, no. How was the publishing process for you?
Well,
it can be
that
hard
was,
as a first-time writer.
as a first-time older writer, and that second part is important because it was not an area that I knew anything at all about. And when I had an acceptable draft to submit, I did some research, and the first question is, do I need an agent? And I figured no agent worth their salt is going to pick up someone my age as a first timer. And also for me, I didn't want to spend the time, and I wanted it out there fast, which all writers do, of course, but being older puts a little edge on that. And fortunately for me, in my genre, which is broadly science fiction or fantasy, there are a fair number of publishers that will look at manuscripts from people that do not have agents. Most of the big publishers do not, but there are many publishers in that genre that will take things. And I gave myself a year. I said, if no one picks it up in a year, then I'll have to learn about self-publishing. But I was very fortunate, and I sent it out, I think totally maybe a dozen places. And there were 3 that wanted the full manuscript and were considering it. And the first one that offered me a contract, I accepted, and I love my publisher. It's All Things That Matter Press, which is a smaller independent publisher in Maine. And they've been terrific. So I was lucky, but it's tough out there. Depending on the type of work you have, it is tough to find a publisher.
So what words of wisdom would you give to someone who may be thinking about writing? This crisis with coronavirus has made a lot of people maybe look at their lives and think, I'd really rather be doing something else. So if somebody's thinking about writing as a new path, what would you tell them?
It will sound simple and obvious, but write. Even if what you write is, you think it's terrible, well, maybe you'll write 5 terrible pages, and then all of a sudden you'll write 5 brilliant ones. Experiment with different things, figure out what you want to write. Do you want to write poetry? Do you want to write, I think it's a good time and an important time to write about your everyday experiences, because I think those are significant. One thing I tried to do in my book was talk about the everyday experiences of people, and how sometimes we look at history as the big events, but there are, everyday lives that are important too. And the history of everyday life during certain experiences, I think, is important. So just write, do your writing, and experiment, play, have fun, enjoy it. I never thought I would write a novel, and I've written in all of my careers. I've written when I was an attorney. I wrote briefs, and when I was a teacher, I taught writing, and I wrote with my students. And when I was a union rep, I wrote position papers for the union. I always wrote, and any type of writing you do, I think, helps other writing that you do.
Great. So I don't normally ask this, but your book has so many little genre bits, if I can call it that. Would you read just a short snippet so our audience gets a flavor of the Better Angels?
Sure. If I may, I'll read a bit from the beginning where my character is introduced, so you can see how I came up with my protagonist, and then another page from when she recognizes that she's going to have an adventure that she totally did not expect, and it begins her on her coming of the next age. But I'll read 2 pages, if I may, in introducing her. And her name is Aggie May. I chose the name because Agatha Christie, right? I had to have, you know, I had to give a little nod to my love of mysteries that I developed as a teenager and has stayed with me. Aggie was newly retired after decades spent working in a dilapidated high school tucked into a part of Connecticut characterized by double-digit unemployment and a Rust Belt landscape of shuttered factories. She had never looked far beyond her own gritty school in her own small town. Surely teaching science to kids was its own reward, especially when many of those kids made it to class without the benefit of clean clothes or breakfast. Granted, helping a teenager build a simple robot or use a prism to create a rainbow was pretty basic science and hardly a remedy for all of life's ills. Still, she had been trained in science, trusted its ability to explain and inspire. Aggie hadn't wanted to retire. She was childless, a widow. There were no grandchildren to tend. She didn't have a bucket list and had no interest in compiling one. But things changed at the teachers' union spring meeting. The union president, wearing a rumpled suit and an unaccustomed look of defeat, had spelled out the bad news to the restless faculty members crowded into the cafeteria. Negotiations on a new contract had not gone well, and state arbitrators had rubber-stamped the Pawtucket School Board's austerity plan, scheduled to take effect in the fall. Running a hand through his thinning hair, he bluntly explained how a slew of new contract provisions would eliminate most of the longevity benefits senior teachers counted on to help in retirement. The board didn't see any point in rewarding a veteran's years of experience when an enthusiastic 22-year-old could be hired for half the price. So it's pretty much bad news coming out of arbitration, ladies and gents, he concluded. The town cried bankruptcy and retrenchment, and the panel handed them a big box of tissues to dry their eyes and mop us up. Bottom line, if you're anywhere close to retiring, file for your pension while the current contract is still in force. If you don't, it's going to cost you. It had been a troubling message, and Aggie prayed he was wrong. But that night, sitting at her kitchen table, she ran the numbers herself and reached the same bleak conclusion. She submitted her intent to retire notice the following day, shocked at how quickly and completely her world had been upended. She loved her boisterous and unruly students, even Connor Pulaski, who had distinguished himself by ejecting a fully loaded 3-drawer metal file cabinet from the principal's second-story window in a fairly effective protest of the largely negative material contained in his permanent record. Then there was Jackie Swenson, who had plagiarized an entire essay on climate change due to the mistaken belief that a teacher as old as Ms. May would never successfully navigate her way to the relatively obscure online source of the elegantly worded article she had submitted under her own name. I've been teaching longer than you've been living, Aggie had informed the girl calmly. Don't try that trick again. Jackie pretended confusion about the red NC penciled on her paper. And this is supposed to mean no credit, bird brain, Connor called out, having eavesdropped on the whole exchange. Also not cool. Ms. M ain't stupid, yo. Aggie's last weeks at school had passed in a blur. She took down posters from her bulletin board, handed back student portfolios, and attended one final graduation ceremony in the gym. The seniors had been beautiful. the girls in pastel dresses and the boys self-conscious but proud in their blazers and ties. With pomp and circumstance playing over the tinny sound system, the ROTC cadets marched in with the flag. The students received their diplomas, and then it was over. A few weeks later, Aggie stood by her kitchen table on a blistering midsummer day, sipping iced tea and gazing out at her garden. She felt uneasy. Now what? Something didn't feel right. She was not Ms. M anymore, not a teacher, not employed, not anything really. Outside, a robin hopped about near one of the tomato plants. A fat bumblebee disappeared into a pink gladiolus. Aggie finished her tea and set the glass on the counter. It was time to accept her new reality. She had come to terms with loss before, her husband's premature death, the fact that there had been no children. Most people liked retirement. She could garden, volunteer, visit her siblings, all good. And yet, something didn't feel right. So that's my character.
Ooh, she sounds like quite a character, actually. So great. So I noted earlier, and you said it too, that you're working on a second in the series. So yeah. What can you share about that book?
Well, the mystery in the first book has to do with the search for what the seniors hope they can find, a photographic portrait of Abraham Lincoln created by the Civil War photographer Matthew Brady. And Matthew Brady is considered the father of photojournalism. And he sent photographers out to the Battle of Antietam to take pictures on the, not on the field of battle, but immediately afterward when the dead were there and had not yet been buried. And then they brought those pictures back, and Brady exhibited them in New York City. And it was, I mean, you can still find online, you can still find the New York Times review of this exhibit, The Dead of Antietam. And it was shocking. It was, I think it was the way that people felt much later when they began to see pictures from Vietnam on the news, or the pictures even in Life magazine of World War II, where suddenly war wasn't romanticized and far away. It was right there in front of them. So the first book deals with that period of time in New York City, which is a fascinating period of time. The second book, I turned to another part of history that I'm fascinated with and I think is very important, which is the 1930s, and in particular, the lead up to World War II. And before the United States entered the war, there were quite a few groups within the United States that supported what Hitler was doing in Germany. And a lot of people think, oh, World War II started in 1941, and then Hitler was there out of nowhere. I mean, Hitler came to power in January of 1933, and within the United States, there was the German-American Bund, there was America First, led by Charles Lindbergh, the aviator. A lot of universities had exchange programs with Germany, and I've been fascinated by that. I think it's relevant to so much now, and there are discussions about that issue. So in the second book, the mystery will revolve around that period of time.
I'm looking forward to reading that one then. And thank you much for your time, Betty. Remember, those of you at home, you can order the bundles through your favorite online retailers, or you can borrow it from the library. You should also check out Betty's great blog where she discusses books, history, and way more at Bono. So thank you so much, Betty. Also, for more videos and information about the Westport Library, please visit westportlibrary.org.
Thank you very much.